So Mark Carney gave Donald Trump exactly what he asked for. And that's what destroyed him. Not a partial concession, not a diplomatic hedge, the full thing. Every demand Trump had publicly staked his credibility on, every condition his team had leaked to the press as the non-negotiable floor for any agreement. Every number his trade advisors had told the markets was the minimum required outcome. Canada delivered it, signed it, presented it in a format that would have allowed the White House to hold a press conference, generate the clips, and declare a historic American victory before the weekend news cycle. The deal was there. The win was there. It was sitting on the table in a folder that had been prepared with the specific, deliberate forensic care of a government that had spent 3 months engineering a perfect exit for the other side. And then the plan collapsed. Not because Canada pulled back, not because the terms changed, not because of anything the Canadian side did or failed to do. It collapsed because the White House couldn't process a genuine win when it looked like one. It collapsed because the machinery designed to extract maximum public humiliation from. The other side had no operating mode for the situation it now faced. A counterparty that had agreed to everything quietly without drama and was now sitting in a room waiting for the other side to simply say yes. Warren Buffett, who received a detailed account of what happened inside that negotiation from sources on both sides within hours of the meeting's end, responded with a precision that only 94 years of watching human nature produce financial outcomes can generate. There is no more dangerous position in a negotiation, Buffett said, than getting everything you asked for from someone who understood exactly what they were doing when they gave it to you. When you understand what Carney actually handed Trump, why he handed it, what he expected to happen next, and why what happened instead has left economic analysts describing the most self-defeating 48 hours in American trade negotiating history, you will understand why the institutions that manage $6.44 trillion in cross-border North American commerce are now operating on contingency frameworks they hoped never to activate. Hit subscribe because what unfolded in that room is not over and the second chapter is already being written. Let me walk you through how we got here, because this didn't emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a very specific sequence of miscalculations that each seemed defensible in isolation and became catastrophic in combination. The trade conflict between the United States and Canada had been running for 10 months when the internal debate inside the Canadian government reached its decisive moment. 10 months of tariffs, counter-tariffs, escalating rhetoric, supply chain disruption, and the slow grinding damage to the $6.44 trillion combined economic relationship that forms the operational core of North American manufacturing, energy, and agriculture. 10 months during which the Canadian government had absorbed the public insults, managed the domestic political pressure, executed the quiet diversification strategy, the European frameworks, the Pacific energy agreements, the preliminary rare earth arrangements, and waited with a discipline that most governments cannot sustain for the moment when the strategic environment was precisely right to move. That moment, according to officials from both sides who provided detailed accounts to sources throughout this reporting, arrived not through a change in the trade conflict itself, but through a change in the American political environment. Trump's approval ratings on the economy had declined for 4 consecutive months. Business coalition pressure from American manufacturers exposed to Canadian supply chain disruption had reached the level where Republican senators in industrial states were delivering private messages to the White Hole. See that the political cost of the conflict was accumulating faster than its political benefit. The tariff revenues that had been projected as economic wins were being offset. In the analyses coming out of the American Manufacturing Council and the Chamber of Commerce by supply chain cost increases that were showing up in consumer prices in ways that polling was beginning to capture, Washington needed a resolution. It needed it to look like an American victory, and it needed it in a form that could be packaged, photographed, and delivered to a news cycle before the quarterly economic test. Data arrived. Most Americans don't realize that this created a window, a specific time-limited diplomatic window that the Canadian government had been quietly engineering for 3 months. The strategy, later described by one Canadian official as the most sophisticated political trap in recent North American diplomatic history, was not a trap in the conventional sense. There was no deception involved. Every element of what Canada offered was genuine. The concessions were real. The numbers were accurate. The framework was workable. The trap, if that word applies, was constructed entirely from truth. Canada would give Trump everything he had publicly demanded, not approximately, not conditionally, exactly. And the theory, the elegant, carefully reasoned, precisely calibrated theory, was that a man who had spent 10 months demanding specific outcomes and framing them as the test of American negotiating strength could not, in front of his own team and his own political constituency, refuse to accept them when they were delivered. The theory was correct in every particular. The execution was flawless. The outcome was not what the theory predicted. And that is what makes what happened in the next 48 hours not just diplomatically significant, but historically instructive in ways that economists and political scientists will be analyzing for decades. The meeting took place in a suite of rooms at a Washington hotel chosen by mutual agreement. Neither the White House, which would have given the American side a symbolic advantage, nor the Canadian embassy, which would have been read as a concession by the other side. Neutral ground, functional space, a setting that communicated by its deliberate ordinariness that what was happening in these rooms was business, not theater. A Canadian delegation arrived first. Mark Carney, a company coming by his most senior trade negotiator to economic advisors, and a legal team that sources describe as among the most technically prepared in Canadian diplomatic history, entered the conference room at 9:14 in the morning and arranged themselves with the quiet efficiency of people who have rehearsed this moment many times. The documents were organized and placed on the table. Water was poured, laptops were opened, and then they waited. The American delegation arrived 11 minutes late. Sources on the Canadian side described the 11 minutes not as a provocation. The delay was likely logistical, but as a window of observation. The Canadian team used those 11 minutes to note what the American delegation was carrying when they entered. Standard folders, a laptop, one binder, the kind of documentation load that signals a team that expects to be presented to, not a team that expects to negotiate. The session opened with the standard diplomatic protocols, introductions, expressions of mutual commitment to a productive outcome, the careful professional courtesy that both sides maintained throughout what was about to become one of the most uncomfortable diplomatic sessions in recent memory. And then Carney spoke. He did not begin with a position. He did not begin with an opening offer. He did not perform the standard diplomatic choreography of establishing parameters within which the negotiation would operate. He placed a document on the table, a single document bound 187 pages with tabs, and he said with the calm, unmurried precision that sources who were present describe as the most disquing thing about the entire session. The silence that followed lasted by multiple accounts, approximately 8 seconds. Long enough for every person in the room to understand that something unexpected had just occurred. The American lead negotiator looked at the document. He looked at Carney. He looked at the document again. He did not pick it up. Carney continued. He walked the American delegation through the document methodically, section by section, with the measured patience of a former governor of 2 G7 central banks who has spent his professional life explaining complex financial structures to people who need to understand them clearly before they can act on them. The steel and aluminum tariff structure Trump had demanded as a baseline for any agreement. It was in the document exactly as specified, with the timelines Trump's team had publicly identified as non-negotiable. The agricultural market access terms that American farm state senators had cited in 4 speeches is the minimum required. They were in the document precise to the percentage point in language that the American negotiating team had itself drafted in a term sheet circulated 6 weeks earlier. The energy pricing framework that the White House had described in three separate press briefings as a core American priority. It was in the document with implementation timelines that were more favorable to the American side than the versions the White House had been publicly demanding. Canada had not met Trump's demands. Canada had exceeded them materially, measurably, in ways that a competent trade negotiator reviewing the document could verify against the public record within 30 minutes. The American negotiator asked for a recess at the 47-minute mark. Sources describe the recess as lasting 23 minutes, during which multiple phone calls were made to the White House. When the American delegation returned to the table, the lead negotiator's affect had changed in ways that sources on the Canadian side noticed immediately. He was, as one source described it, reading from a different script than the one he had walked in with. What followed over the next 90 minutes is what diplomatic historians will examine as the central puzzle of this episode. The American delegation did not reject the Canadian offer. They did not counter it. They did not identify specific elements that required modification or raise concerns about implementation timelines or propose alternative language for contested provisions. What they did with increasing desperation as the session continued was attempt to find problems that weren't there. They raised process objections. The document had been presented without advance notice or diplomatic channels, which was technically accurate and entirely beside the point, given that its contents were drawn directly from American demands. They raised sovereignty, framing concerns. The language in certain sections, they suggested, might be read as implying Canadian concessions under duress rather than voluntary agreement. A concern so abstract and so disconnected from the document's actual commercial terms that sources on the Canadian side describe exchanging glances they were professionally obligated not to make visible. They raised implementation sequencing questions that, when pressed for specifics, resolved into nothing. Carney listened to each objection with the same expression sources described throughout: attentive, untroubled, professionally engaged. He addressed each one directly with precision, without impatience. When the process objection was raised, he offered to have the document formally transmitted through diplomatic channels that afternoon and reconvene the following morning. When the sovereignty framing concern was raised, he offered 3 alternative language options for the real EVAT sections, each of which preserved the commercial terms while modifying the framing language in precisely the way the American side had suggested. When the implementation sequencing questions arrived without specifics, he asked gently for the specific concerns to be identified so they could be addressed. The American side could not identify them because they did not exist. At the 2-hour and 11-minute mark, the American lead negotiator said something that sources on both sides of the table describe as the sentence that defined the session. He said, "We need to take this back to Washington." Carney nodded. He said, "Of course." He paused. Then he said, "I want to make sure I understand what you're taking back. What you have in front of you is the full agreement, as your side has described it publicly for 10 months. There are no conditions attached to it. There is no expiration on this offer. But I'd ask that you communicate to your principals that what is on the table today is what was asked for. Nothing more and nothing less." The American delegation left the room at 11:47 a.m. The Canadian delegation remained for another 20 minutes in a session that sources describe as notably quiet. Carney sat at the table. His team sat around him. No one reviewed documents. No one made phone calls. They waited out the time it takes for the other side to reach the elevator. Then Carney said 4 words that one source present has described as the most economically prescient sentence spoken in North American diplomacy in a decade. He said, "They can't pick bees." The aftermath arrived with the speed and the specific character of a crisis that no one had prepared for because no one had imagined it was possible. Within 4 hours of the American delegation's departure, the first signals that the White House was struggling to process what had happened began to emerge through the channels that experienced Washington observers know to read. not press statements, not official communications. But the pattern of anonymously sourced leaks to friendly journalists that characterizes an administration trying to build a narrative before the facts establish one independently. The initial framing that emerged from these sources was that the Canadian offer contained significant unresolved issues that required further analysis. This framing lasted approximately 6 hours before the economic press began requesting specifics, at which point it became clear that no one in the American delegation could identify what those issues were. The second framing, which replaced the first by early evening, was that the process by which Canada had presented the offer was irregular, and that the White House required it to be transmitted through proper diplomatic channels. This framing was technically defensible and substantively irrelevant, which is precisely the combination that signals an administration buying time it doesn't know how to use. Markets, which had been positioned for the announcement of an agreement since credible reports of the meeting's framework began circulating the week before, responded to the silence with the specific kind of volatility that reflects not pessimism, but confusion. The Dow declined 580 points in the final 2 hours of trading. Crosper industrial stocks, which have been rallying for 6 sessions in anticipation of a deal, gave back 60% of those gains in a single afternoon. Canadian dollar positions, which had priced in a probability-weighted expectation of agreement, moved in ways that currency traders describe as consistent with a binary outcome suddenly having its probability distribution reset to near uniform uncertainty. The $6.4 trillion in cross-border commerce that had been waiting for directional clarity received instead the worst possible signal that the other side had received what it asked for and still couldn't say yes. Your 401k lost 3% in a single quarter because of this trade war, and accord, to me, it is only going to get more expensive from here. Now, before I continue, I want to quickly mention something that I think every American over 60 needs to see right now. Everything we have been covering, the tariffs, the inflation, the impact on retirement savings, I have compiled all of it into a complete guide called the Buffett Blueprint. It applies Warren Buffett's own investment principles. So the specific threat this trade war poses to your retirement, your 401k, your Social Security, your fixed income, all covered with a real protection plan. You can start this week. The link is right below this video. It is called the Buffett Blueprint. Check it out. Warren Buffett issued a statement through Berkshire Hathaway that afternoon that was 3 sentences long and contained more economic analysis than most quarterly reports. In 6 decades of deal-making, Buffett said, I have seen a transaction fail at the finish line for one of 2 reasons. The terms were wrong or the decision maker wasn't actually empowered to decide. When the terms are demonstrably right, when they match what was publicly requested, precisely in writing with signatures available, only one explanation remains. The authority to close the deal does not exist where it was assumed to exist. He paused the statement there, which is itself a form of communication, and then added the line that trading desks quoted for the remainder of the week. In 60 years of doing business, I have never once seen a counterparty reject their own demands. I have now seen it happen through a sovereign government. The markets will take some time to understand what that means for every future negotiation this administration conducts. The Buffett statement moved markets not because it contained information the markets didn't have, but because it provided the interpretive framework the markets have been unable to construct on their own. The explanation for why the most economically rational outcome, the one that both parties' public positions pointed directly toward, had not occurred. Buffett named it decision-making authority, had not been where it was assumed to be. The negotiating team that walked out of that hotel conference room was not the team that could close a deal. The team that could close the deal was in the White House watching coverage, and the coverage was not telling them what had happened in the room. It was telling them what their advisors thought they needed to hear. The cascading consequences of a non-agreement that should have been an agreement are a category of damage that economic models were not designed to measure, because economic models are built on the assumption that rational actors pursue their stated interests when those interests are achievable at the stated price. What happens when that assumption fails is not a correctable market inefficiency. It is a structural credibility event, a moment when counterparties in every future negotiation this administration conducts update their priors about whether the American side stated demands reflect what the American side will actually accept. The credibility cost begins in Ottawa, where the Canadian government is now facing a domestic political environment that has moved decisively and perhaps permanently past the point of offering the kind of concessions contained in that 187-page document. The Canadian officials who constructed that offer, who made the political case internally that demonstrating good faith with maximum transparency was the right strategy, are now answering to a political constituency that has watched maximum good faith produce no agreement. The next Canadian government negotiating posture, whoever leads it under whatever political conditions, will not be constructed around the theory that Trump's stated demands can be satisfied. By satisfying them, that theory has been tested to destruction. The credibility cost extends to every other country want. A negotiation means extracting maximum value from the other side. Closing a negotiation means reaching an outcome that both sides can sustain and build on. Canada's 187-page document was not constructed to extract maximum value. It was constructed to give the other side an outcome it could sustain, one built on that side's own stated requirements, in that side's own language at that side's own demanded price. It was the most generous opening position in the history of this bilateral conflict, and it was rejected not because it was insufficient, but because the system it was presented to had no mechanism for accepting it. Warren Buffett's 4 appearances in the account of these 48 hours form a complete philosophical arc, the hook. There's no more dangerous position in a negotiation than getting everything you asked for from someone who understood exactly what they were doing when they gave it to you. The translation, what Canada presented, was not a gift. It was a demonstration of what's possible, of what was publicly demanded, and what the American side could not bring itself to accept the authority verdict. The authority to pose a deal does not exist where it was assumed to exist. The final reckoning. I have never once seen a counterparty reject their own demands. 4 sentences, 60 years of pattern recognition applied to 48 hours of events. The arc they describe is not one of victory or defeat. It is one of institutional failure. The failure of a decision-making system to process information that was delivered to it clearly, accurately, and completely. The 187-page document is still in the folder. The tabs are still in place. The signatures that could have been on it, that were prepared and waiting to be placed on it, are not there. The $6.4 trillion economic relationship is operating without the directional clarity that the document would have provided. The 47,000 workers whose supply chain situations depend on that clarity are still waiting. The NORAD modernization is still stalled. The Five Eyes relationship is still operating at reduced efficiency. The European and Pacific alternative frameworks Canada built during the conflict are still active and still proceeding. And Mark Carney is sitting in Ottawa with a 187-page document that represents everything the other side said it wanted in a folder waiting. The question is not whether the agreement will eventually happen. The economic logic that required it 10 months ago still requires it today with compounding urgency. The question is what it will cost to get there from here, what additional damage will accumulate, what additional alternatives Canada will finalize, what additional credibility the American side will spend in other negotiations while this one remains open before the decision-making authority that Buffett identified is absent finally arrives at the table. Carney handed Trump exactly what he asked for. He watched the plan collapse, and he is still holding the document because he understood something that markets are only now beginning to price correctly. The party that walks out of a room having offered everything and been answered with silence is not the party in the weaker position. It is the party that now knows exactly what it is dealing with. That knowledge in the next round of every negotiation that follows is worth more than any single concession in any single 187-page document. Canada knows what it's dealing with. The world knows what it's dealing with. And Warren Buffett has already bet on what that knowledge produces next. Every future meeting, every future proposal, every future document presented across the table between these two countries will carry the weight of what happened in that Washington hotel. Not as grievance, as information. Canada walked in carrying everything the other side said it wanted. It walked out carrying something more durable than an agreement. It walked out carrying the clearest possible picture of what this negotiation actually requires to close, and it is not more concessions. It is different decision until that changes. The folder stays closed, the document stays unsigned, and the consequences keep compounding in ways that no press statement and no true social post can stop, measure, or reverse. Music, music, baby, music, music, foreign, foreign, music, music, music. But let music it die. Would music, music, you say, love to the music, music, foreign, foreign, music, come on, music, music, singing, music, music. Is it for music, music, singing, music, music, what they could maybe, music, 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 Daenerys, music,